Welcome, everyone, to today's edition of the Center for Family-Owned Businesses webinar for First Bank. On behalf of the Center for Family-Owned Businesses, my name is Ed Hart. I'm the director for the center. Also like to welcome all of our audience from around the United States and all over that might be watching and with us today. We bring these webinars to you each month with the hope that we can educate you on issues that are pertinent and relevant to your family-owned business. We have run these webinars each month, and at the beginning of each webinar, like we'd like to do right now, we will be showing a quick video from our chairman and president, Mr. Michael Dierberg, after which we will introduce our speakers today. So just sit back and watch this video with Michael Dierberg, and we'll be right back.
When you look out to the horizon, what do you see? What does tomorrow look like? If you run a family-owned business, you see the future differently. As part of the fourth generation of my family, to help lead First Bank, I know we see the future like you. At the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses, your vision is ours. Now let our experience be yours. In this seminar, let us help you see what your future can be.
We are hosting today's webinar from our new studios here at Irvine, California at Hitch Radio, where we will be hosting all of our webinars moving forward. We'd like to thank Brian Colbert and his team for bringing these webinars to you. Over the past several months, and actually since the pandemic began, we've had a lot of conversations with family-owned businesses about issues that are relevant to them. And it seems like the issue that comes up more than anything else has been the topic of culture. This culture is slightly different, as we've talked about in the past, as we've gone through the pandemic and lots of different changes in our companies with transitions in the way we work and where we work and so forth. So our vision over the last few months has been to have this conversation on culture with you. We have had Donna Brighton, who is with us again today, and Dr. Allie Taylor talk with us over the last couple of months about how we can, first of all, the topic of what culture is and how culture and looking at our culture can help us as an organization. We are having that conversation again today. Donna talked at first about really helping us define what culture is, what it means to enhance our culture, and then we took a deeper dive with Allie, talking about how family dynamics and our history and our past can really have an impact on the way we do business now. We thought we would bring this all together now and have a conversation with Donna and Allie to talk further about how, as an organization and how family businesses, using the experiences that have impacted us in the past and what we're going through now moving forward as an organization, how we need to really just look at our culture through the lens of these changes that we're going through. I'd like to bring in Dr. Allie Taylor with Orange Kiwi Consulting in Orange County, California, and Donna Brighton from Brighton Leadership in Scottsdale, Arizona, to lead us on this conversation. If you'd like to make contact with Allie or Donna after the webinar today, we will have their contact information for you. You can also find it on our website at www.first.bank/family-business. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please feel free to use the chat feature. You can type in your question, and as appropriate with timing and so forth, we will get to those questions. If you have other questions about the center or questions about other webinars and topics or suggestions, you can email me directly at ed.hart@fbol.com. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Allie Taylor of Orange Kiwi Consulting and Donna Brighton of Brighton Leadership. Allie and Donna, take it away.
Thanks, Ed. Donna, it's so good to see you again.
You too, Allie.
Oh my gosh, I've been looking forward to this conversation, and in part because of a couple of the families that I've been working with recently, and one that we've talked a little bit about had a family member who worked in a large for-profit company or a large public company outside of her family business. And she really was focused on driving culture change and had remarkable efforts as a CEO for a multinational company, came back into the family business, and it wasn't as easy. She was really struggling. So I'm really looking forward to understanding your perspective and hearing a little bit more about, just from an organizational culture perspective, why it's so different to get change in family business. So there's a lot of talk about culture these days.
Yes.
What makes culture so important to getting results in any business? Let's start there.
Excellent, Allie. And before I even answer that question, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what culture is, right? Because it's one of those words like communication. We all use it, but it means something different to different people. So culture is not whether you wear flip-flops, have a foosball table, or free lunch Friday. Those are all things that may be indicators of your culture, but it's deeper than that. And the very simple way to think about culture is really the way we do things around here. It's the unwritten rules that everybody understands. Do we speak up at meetings or do we keep our mouths shut? It tells us how to behave in the context of that organization. It tells us what our values are and what matters most. So that's really what we're getting at when we talk about culture in the family business. And I'm excited to learn from you, Allie, as well, because I'm sharing from a culture perspective in an organization, the value of it. To your question, why is it so important to get results? Is because culture in and of itself can either accelerate or drag down your delivery of business results. Because we all know you can have a strategy, right? It's the beginning of the year. We're excited. We're setting goals. We're like, yes, we're so excited about what we can accomplish in the coming year. But how many times do you actually consistently hit your goals? And if you don't, culture could be the answer. So research shows that when you align that strategy with your culture, your people strategy, you can achieve up to a 50% difference in your performance, which is your results, right? So that means culture can be a competitive advantage. However, there's some complicating factors when it comes to family systems, Allie. So tell us, why is this so much more difficult for leaders in the context of that family business, like the leader you were talking about at the start of our conversation?
Yeah, we'll call her Kate, and we'll get to that story in just a second. You know what we forgot to do, Donna? We forgot to tell our participants how they can interact with us if they have their own questions. So let me just pause there. You do have access to a question feature, and you can click on it and go ahead and type in your questions. You can do it anonymously. Only Donna, myself, and Ed are able to see those. So feel free to type in and ask as specific a question as you might like. Kate, when she called, her big question was really coming from a place of deep confusion. She was very confused. And the reason was because she had this great high-performing team that she was working with that had a culture that could accelerate their results. Mm-hmm. And she did all the right things. She came into the family business and it was like hitting a brick wall. When she said it to me with tears in her eyes. So I'm not making light of it. What I'm thinking about is the joy that she got afterwards when she was finally able to conquer it. That gives me a huge smile. The brick wall she had to conquer was actually the family system dynamics and the way decision-making happened in her family business and who was empowered to make decisions, who wasn't, where the influence rested, and how power got used. That is very different in a family-run business because of the family system, and then that doesn't exist in a public company where the bottom line is the bottom line. At the end of the day, do we make profit for shareholders or not? The bottom line in a family business looks very different. Mm-hmm. Did we make money for the shareholders? That might not be our number one priority. It's your emotional wealth of the family, like the relationships, the intangible parts. That sometimes has a stronger bottom line in families. And then other ones, it's more of a balance.
Mm-hmm. And Allie, a quick question on that. You talked about family systems. Is that just the people that are working in the family business?
That's a good question. No. So whether they're shareholders or not, if they have any influence over what happens in the family business. So sometimes family businesses have a set of rules. They have a family charter that outlines who gets to work in the business and who doesn't, who gets to sit on the board and who doesn't, how decisions are made or not. Sometimes they'll say spouses who are non-lineal descendants of the family or not blood relations or adopted, that they can't work in the family. And the mistake is to think because we put that barrier in place, they don't have influence.
Yeah.
A lot of times, right, that spouse still has influence. And if we don't account for it, we can get things stuck. And interestingly, that's part of what was happening for Kate. So Donna, when you think about the thought that came to my mind, actually I've got three now running through my mind, but the thought that really connects is, what makes it more difficult in your experience with culture change for leaders when they're new in a business or they haven't really led transformation in the past? What's the challenge for them?
The older an organization is, it feels like the more set in the culture is. I've worked with organizations that were like a carve out, meaning it was a piece of an organization that got pulled and created. And that was like brand new. So they were inventing the culture and the people brought some thinking with them. It was pretty flexible in terms of a cultural system. For new leaders, like in the example with Kate, coming into that family system and not being clear on exactly what the culture is, it's easy to make a lot of assumptions based on observation, right? But without truly paying attention to culture, which is a level deeper than what you can just see, and understanding the beliefs and values that people within the organization have that cause them to behave in certain ways, if you don't have an understanding of that, you can make a lot of misinformed or have assumptions that are completely incorrect because you don't have that data. So in leading change, another challenge I've seen with leaders is they think it's somebody else's job, right? I'll just appoint a person in charge of this, right? I'll hire a consultant. I'll tell my HR leader it's their job. They need to fix this. And the reality is that leaders are part of creating the change, right? So we call that sponsorship in the world of change management, or it's just being a great leader, right? And as a leader, if you are not participating, if you're not involved, if you're not role modeling, if you're not communicating, if you're not engaging everybody, like all of those things are absolutely essential as a leader. And it's really easy to think, I'm super busy driving this business. We need to get sales up. We need to grow. All these things that are important. Oh my gosh, the economy, I need to handle that. But that does not take away your responsibility in leading change as the head of that organization.
That's really good. And the interesting piece of that from a family perspective is sometimes when we're doing a generational succession, right? And the generation that is currently leading the business, wanting to pass it to the next generation, they've got the success being and doing in ways that they always have. And they don't really intend to change. They intend for the next generation to change, right? So they say, okay, you come in, you want to do the culture thing, go ahead. But the power still rests with the now generation, and we wonder why we can't get the transformation when they're both in the business. So the point that you drive home is that both generations have to be aligned and willing to change their own behavior.
Correct. Because everybody in the organization is looking to them, right? So say if we're going from G3 to G4 and making that transition, and like you just said, and G3 is saying, all right, G4, you show up and you be different and you do what you're supposed to, but we're going to keep behaving like we always have been behaving. The organization is wired to pay attention to those leaders from the G3, and it's going to undermine G4 and prevent that change from occurring. So Allie, just thinking about that in creating culture change, what's something that leaders need to do to ensure the success of their culture?
In a family business, I think you hit the nail on the head. The generations can't point the finger at each other. They have to both be aligned, right? And they have to both value the change that they say they want authentically. It can't be, yes, we commit, but then go do something else. It's got to be, yes, we commit, and we'll go through the self-reflection. We'll go through looking at it, what it's going to mean for me and how my identity is going to be challenged and how the way I used to feel a sense of significance or used to operate is going to be much harder because I have to do it differently. And then looking to both generations to accept that they're both going to have to change. The younger generation has all these ideas that they think they want to implement and do, but there's an organization they have to take them along with. So the next generation, often it's patience and persistence. And the older generation, it's often more openness and self-reflection and really getting authentic with themselves about the implications. And the other piece of it, I think that is sometimes subtler, is when the next gen, out of respect and admiration and honor of the current generation that's leading them and ancestors who may not even be alive anymore, that legacy and their desire to honor it, sometimes they engage in behaviors that actually sabotage the transition because they won't be honest with the now generation and say, we want you to have significance and we love you and care for you and there's place and value to you being here, but we can't accept these behaviors. We really need you to help us by changing these. And they won't have that hard conversation. It's like rats on the wheel going nowhere. They keep trying to get change, but they won't make the real change that they need to make.
Yeah. And Allie, I heard something really important in there. You talked about even in a generation of leaders that's transitioning to the next generation, they need to be willing to change. And I feel like that's one of the hardest things as a leader. Like there was a really funny cartoon. It was like, you change, right? Like you change, you change. And as a leader, if the leader does not change, and even if you're retiring, which that's a big change for the leaders who are transitioning out of a business. So that's a whole other conversation. But for them to transition leadership well, it's not just here you go, here's the keys. Like you're driving a new car and I'm handing you the keys. It's not that easy, right? No. So thinking about, wow, not only am I letting go in that transition, right? Because all change starts with letting go, but that can be hard. So I'm letting go, giving it to the next generation. Oh, and on top of that, you're asking me to change. Wow, that's hard.
Yes, absolutely. You nailed it. Letting go, loss, grief. The question most often that's the subtext is, will I still be relevant? That it's a force right against letting go. That's about holding on. That's where the family has to get really honest and real about what this transition means for the family system. And that's a piece that I think a lot of times when we think about change, we don't have to think about it anywhere else, even though we all bring our families to work with us, right? You're bringing your family no matter where you work, because they're a part of you and they're core to your identity. Identity is the biggest driver of behavior. So we all take our families to work, but in a family business, the entire family brings the same legacy, narrative, family history attached to the business, even though we play different roles in it. It's getting clear about the impact of those roles. So sometimes we have a group that has the power and a group that's been disadvantaged, especially in businesses where there are multiple branches. We go through these transitions, power shifts, and different branches or different groups of people start to get different levels of power. And the family system gets disrupted because they're not supposed to have what I had. And now I don't have it, right? So it's a much more profound human behavior change. And how advisors do and don't support that family can make all the difference.
And it's interesting, Allie, because one of the key distinctions I feel in change is understanding change is that external thing that's happening. So whether it's transition from generation to generation, or if it's change, like we're recognizing that the culture we have doesn't support those business results that we talked about, whatever that is, that's change. Like you can decide we're going to change. But the difference is the internal transition, right? Because each person transitions means they go through their process of how they're adjusting and adapting to the change. Everybody does it different. So then you complicate it by what you just shared with this family system. So I'm dealing with the family patterns of how we do or don't deal with transition well. So it's a combination of all of that can be really sticky. What's a family business to do? Successful and change. It sounds so hard.
No, the coolest thing, right? The thing that gives a family business a competitive advantage is the family. It's their socio-emotional wealth. It's who else is going to have your back? Who else have so much power by being invested in seeing something succeed or win? So once I love when you talk about culture change and you have the slide with arrows going in all different directions. That's the same. That's one of the things that is the same, right? We have to get the family to agree on what that direction is, get all the arrows pointing the same way, and then the socio-emotional wealth in that family will allow them to outcompete other businesses over and over. Family businesses prove that through the pandemic. They proved it before the pandemic, and they'll prove it in the coming age, which has such a dynamic environment we've never seen before, where the forces for change and the rate of change is accelerating. So that one study says in 40 years, we will do the amount of change we're experiencing now will happen in a week. And in 80 years, it'll happen in 3 days.
We better improve our capacity.
That's a really important word. Talk about capacity. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, thank you. So capacity is something that I've really become even more aware working in large scale change. It's interesting because sometimes the desire for how much change you want an organization to undergo and what they're able, so that's the capacity for change, that you need to make sure is like in alignment. I had worked with a leader who they were shifting their business strategy, and the leader wisely recognized, I need to pay attention to people's capacity to make the changes they need to make. So here's a really fun way of understanding that. Imagine that inside of you, you have a sponge, and everybody has a different size sponge. I found that a lot of leaders, a way that I know that they're leaders, they have really big sponges. So they are capable of doing lots and lots of change. But not all of your people have that same capacity. So as a leader, you might think, hooray, I'm so excited. We're going to do this new thing. And the reality is when that sponge, just your little change sponge, gets full, saturated, like you can't pick up any more change. And so unfortunately, leaders who are trying to drive a lot of change, they can create dysfunction in the organization by pushing so much change because everybody's saturated. And here's another important point when we talk about capacity and change saturation is that it's not just about like, it's not like I have a little change sponge at work and then there's some changes happening at work that are absorbed here. Oh, and then I go home and then I have my home change. We have one life, right? Like we all talk personal, professional. No, we have a life and we have a change capacity, period. Yeah. So when things are going and we're reading headlines in the newspaper about the economy and inflation and oh my gosh, and the pandemic and the this and that, all of those things are taking up capacity. And then we add the personal changes we're going through, that takes up capacity. So we end up as leaders, we need to pay attention to the capacity within the organization of the people because you can create change. Remember, I said that's the external thing. We can decide we're going to implement this strategy. We're going to make this generational transition. But when people lack that capacity, they can move into dysfunction. And the most wonderful human beings that have the best intention. And I'll tell you a really funny story. I was working with a leader of sales and explaining this whole idea of capacity. And he said, thank you, because he was really worried that he was starting to suffer early stage dementia or Alzheimer's because there was so much change happening for him. He personally was experiencing that overwhelm of so much change. And so just something for everybody to pay attention to. Maybe it's not you after all.
Maybe you're not the one who's going crazy or has dementia. Sometimes it can really feel that way though, right? When you're in the middle of all that change and people around you adapting and getting on board and you desperately want to, but no matter what you do, you just can't get there. So I think in those moments, it's being okay, helping that person be okay to step back and really figure out like, what is your body telling you? There's a mind, body, brain connection. And when you talk about capacity, all of them are at play. So just the power of the pause, push pause, find somebody who can help you just individually, alone, a safe person process, and just ask you 2 or 3 good questions about what's happening inside you, and then be able to come back and have an authentic conversation about your capacity with the people who are driving the change. You have to have a conversation with other people to hold you accountable if you've got this sense of urgency. And I think that's what we see a lot with particularly the family member who has more of the entrepreneurial characteristics. In our last webinar and the one I did, we talked about some of the mental health attributes and psychological attributes common to family businesses. Some of the byproduct is that is you want both. You don't have the capacity, but you want the change. So you just try to push through, and it becomes this chaotic, confusing, and everybody feels that emotional energy and follows the actions of chaos that
Absolutely.
person is introducing. So can you talk about that when it's the person who has the most power in the organization? So positional authority, decision-making control, and the highest level of influence. Can you talk about the impact when that person doesn't have the capacity?
So I wanted to share some really interesting research, and it has to do, you were talking about emotions, which sometimes we like to think, oh, that doesn't happen in business, right? We're just going to come in and get our work done. But the research shows that emotions determine 50 to 70% of workplace climate. So what people are experiencing comes from that emotions, and that climate in the workplace can determine 20 to 30% of the company's performance. So tying back to business results. And then you asked about change. So how you feel about change, right? Because for any of us, we're going through multiple changes at one time. It's not, okay, I'm done with this change and then I move on to the next one. And then the statistics you shared, Allie, holy cow, what, this much change at this compressed time. But how we feel about those changes impact our business results.
Yeah.
And how we manage our emotions because emotions are part of that capacity, right? How we manage those emotions as a leader impacts those around us as they approach change. So for all of you leaders, the question is, how are you feeling about the changes going on? And how are you feeling leads to what are people catching from you?
And that catching piece is super important. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, but that's where culture comes from, right?
Yes.
We are both on the same track.
Yeah.
That's where culture comes from, right? Because people learn, like you might say, I'm an open door policy, come talk to me anytime. But you ask about that leader who is over capacity and they don't have the resilience and the change capacity to deal with anything else. And so that then their attitude towards the change sours. Guess what? Everybody else picks up on that. And so how can they have a successful change? And that's what's so interesting. It's almost like a leader decides, I'm going to make this change no matter what. But what they don't understand is when you implement change, right? I'll just use that word, you install it, right? Like you think like it's a system and it's just going to work. Yeah. But the new system, the new process, the new culture that you're working, it requires people to adapt and adopt whatever that change is. And so there's a difference between installing that external change and the realization of the whole reason you're doing it. And unfortunately, I think sometimes leaders forget that part, right? The reason I'm doing this is to realize these benefits. No, got the change done, check the box, and we're good.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's so true. And I think that's part of what a lot of family businesses are experiencing coming out of the pandemic. Some of these, like Kate's business, 65 years old, right? So they've gone through already 2 generational transitions and move a third to a fourth. So they know what success looks like. They've done it, but it's radically different. And it's the emotional level. It's the fatigue from everything they had to do to pull the business through the pandemic, whether they had record years or were struggling. There's fatigue because they already had to change so much to adapt. Now we're changing back at the same time as our market environment is radically changing. And so how we were in the past, the strategies that worked in the past don't suffice anymore. It's not that they don't work at all, but it's the way that people behave to execute it is changing. And then I just saw a McKinsey article, Gen Z coming in, forcing a whole bunch of different change because talent pools are shrinking. So now if we think about Porter's forces, we have a customer or a talent pool that has more power than the business has had to deal with in the past to accept talent. So that's introducing change. So when you think about this coming season, the next 5 to 10 years, and you're thinking about the types of change that family businesses or any business in particular is going to be looking at. If you were going to give them one thing today to avoid saying in 10 years, I wish I knew this, What was that thing? If you were going to use a foresight lens, what is that thing that you would tell the leaders today?
So, Allie, I think I would like to share the 3 steps to success.
Perfect.
And the reason for that, it's a repeatable process that everyone can apply, right? It's very simple. And it's really know where you are, know where you're going, and figure out how to get there. And I'd love to break that down with you.
Perfect.
So it's about, okay, we've got this culture. We understand we need to make sure like all the business dynamics are changing, right? So where do we start? And I'd love to hear your experience in the family business context. What I found sometimes is that although everybody's at the same business, they see it completely different. So same set of facts, but my perspective on where we are is different than everyone else's, right? And so as a result, if you're not having everyone start at the same place with the same understanding, then how are you going to get anywhere and create any kind of change? So I love the idea in terms of culture and response to the changes of what's going on is starting with objective data, right? So rather than you talked about the power, the PCA dynamic and how this part of the family or that part of the family, like they may be the ones that normally have the stronger voice. So imagine getting objective data, qualitative and quantitative, that everybody can look at and using that as a starting point. So I think that's really important. Step number 1 is let's make sure we all see things maybe not exactly the same, but at least we're, what do they say, singing from the same sheet of music?
Yeah, singing from the same sheet of music. Absolutely. And I agree that quantitative and qualitative data in the business, right? So it's not just the family who's providing it, it's employees. And from the highest level down to individual contributors, right? Getting that data super important because that gives you the baseline then to take into the family conversation, because what we can't ignore is the family system. And when we start to talk about the data objectively, it gives us a lens to look at our family system, the strengths. What are the things that we want to keep? What are the behaviors that make us successful? How is that impacting our employees and driving our culture? And then those things that nobody ever wants to talk. In Kate's case, what the process did was help her brother finally come to terms with the fact that he had been dealing with alcoholism as the CFO and addiction. And the impact, we were able to really see the impact of that behavior on the culture. He didn't have to come out to the whole company. He was just able to have an honest conversation with Kate because he was being burned out with the culture, and that was a coping mechanism for him in the family system that had been created. We're able to connect that back to the family story and see it repeating to generation after generation. And Kate stepped in to do the same thing. She stepped in to rescue the business when her father had a heart attack, not because she really wanted to be part of the family business. Although today she'll tell you she's thriving and happy, and they were able to get the change that they're looking for. I think that's the piece, right? Qualitative and quantitative data from the top to the very bottom of individual contributors in the organization, and then mapping it against the family system and really having those authentic conversations. That tells you where you are.
So that is where the whole conversation around capacity comes in. So imagine everybody that we've now figured out, we're all on the same page. Like Allie said, we have the qualitative, have the quantitative. It's mapped against the family system. Super important, right? Like you can't just do an employee engagement survey and be like, okay, we have, and just tip there. Employee engagement is a lagging indicator like financials, where a culture assessment like we're talking about is actually a leading indicator, right? So it's that. But that in itself is insufficient because we said you also need that family systems data, right? Because that gives you the full picture. Otherwise, you just have a smaller perspective. So deciding where you're going is really, it's that destination point, right? And in leadership, one of the key things is setting the vision. Like, where are we going? Because if you don't have a vision, you're just going to keep doing what you've always done, right? So that's part of leadership. But I would guess that's one of the really hard things in family business because everybody's going to have different ideas. I have a really good friend who his family has one of the oldest wineries in the world. And as the business came through the generations, he ended up with a whole group of relatives, cousins, extended family, and so on. But they didn't want part of their vision for what should happen. It was totally different. Right. And so that's this step number 2, where are you going and how do we get everybody agree? Because otherwise those family dynamics are just going to pull at where you're going and confuse the organization. That deciding where you're going to go, number 1, is like that whole conversation around strategy. And another piece of that, we talked about capacity for change, right? And you can come up with an amazing strategy, but if your culture isn't supporting that strategy and people don't have the capacity, like we're overwhelmed and exhausted, that's why I think well-being has become such an important topic, is because of that overwhelm from change saturation, lack of capacity. So it's a combination of the vision, getting everybody aligned to that strategy of, hey, we want to grow the business. Maybe some people are like, oh, let's move into more states. Let's expand our product line, whatever the decision is, right? And other people are like, oh no, the recession's coming and we need to pull in. So if you have those two fighting forces, that's a problem. So that's step number 2. Where are you going to go? But curious, what are some other family dynamics from that system that can impact people as they're trying to figure out that vision and direction where to go?
Yeah. So your friend who owns the winery, that's a great example. And I know who you're talking about because you were kind enough to introduce me to him. Yeah. So I think the interesting piece of it is the power when you can have those deep conversations. It does 2 things. It gets you aligned on the vision and strategy. But first, because you can't get there without this, first, the family becomes more vulnerable and intimate with each other, because they're having to let go of all the baggage of all the family that you've grown up with, that everybody knows every story, knows how to push each other's buttons, and can wound deeper, because a family is first and foremost an emotional unit. So it can wound deeper, and they have oftentimes behaviors that they don't even know that they're not intentional, they're not mindful of how they're impacting each other in ways that non-family businesses don't have. You bring your professional self to work, or you don't have a job very long. In a family, your professional self is also your personal self when you're dealing just with family members, right? So getting that alignment requires you to lay down your sword, check your ego at the door, and come in with an open mind. So those 3 things, and we have to do those for leaders too, but the family baggage is a lot harder and the sword tends to be a lot sharper.
And Allie, that makes me think, because you were explaining the family systems beyond just the people that are working in the business. So then what happens, right? Because you have a whole family system. So somebody's whispering in one of the business employees' ears. Yes. Then what happens?
Then what happens is you end up investing a whole lot of time, effort, and energy that doesn't return results. And this whole thing is, how do we align our culture to accelerate results?
Yes.
And so I don't know if this is totally fair. So it could be a hasty generalization declaring that. Most often, it's a lack of authentic commitment. It's surface commitment. Everybody is saying, so they're pointing the fingers different ways. And even when they really want to, changing behavior in a family is really hard. It's much more difficult than if I have a job that I go to. When I had to discipline my son in our other business as an employee, I can't discipline him like I'm his mom. It takes more energy and effort for me to put on and take off these different hats. So to your point, getting that alignment and making sure that everybody's committed to the same plan cannot be rushed.
And that's really important, right? Because I sometimes hear people talking about, oh, we're going to do a strategy weekend, right? We're all going to go away and magically sing Kumbaya and bam, we've got our strategy. And what you're saying is, even before we figure out where we're going, we need to work on all of those systems, right? And make sure that it supports whatever we decide on together. Because unfortunately, the end of the story that I was sharing about my friend's winery is that they sold the majority of it, right? Fortunately, he held on to my favorite brand, but but he had a vision, right, to keep going and growing, and the rest of the family wasn't bought in, and it split the business. And that breaks my heart because of all the things you shared, right? As a family business, like this can be one of the most powerful, strong, competitive forces. And that's what we want to see for family business. But you have to get to your point with those arrows. When the arrows are all going different directions, it's this step of getting alignment within the family, within the behaviors, within the beliefs that get everybody pointing in the same direction. And then you can figure out what the direction is.
Agreed. And you know what? I just made like the classic family business mistake. And I'm so glad I wasn't doing this. I called it discipline. No, a parent disciplines a child, but in your business, you coach staff. Even family employees, when I'm going to have a conversation with someone, it's a coaching conversation. It's a completely different one, and I use the same word. Just that subtle thing has an impact on culture. And that's where the mindfulness comes in.
Wow, that's a really powerful example, Allie, because you're right. It drives everything, right? And nobody wants to hear in the workplace, we're going to have a disciplinary conversation.
No kid really wants it either. It's a different story.
Yes. And to your point, it brings in all the drama, but you had a question.
No, it does bring in all the drama. You're right when you do it that way. Okay, we know where we are.
Yes.
We've done all the hard work. We're really leaning into all of our family's assets, our family socio-emotional wealth, all of our time, money, effort, our brain power, bring it all to the table. The arrows are pointing in the same direction. What's next?
So then we get to make a plan, right?
Tell me about that.
So the opportunity is really where you are, where you're going, and the gap between. And if I had a whiteboard behind us, I would draw. Everybody says success is not a straight line from one to the other. It's like that messy, kind of like we go all over the place. But it is better to be clear about where you're going than certain about all the steps in between. Clarity is key. That was step number 2. And then creating the plan, like who's doing what, creating accountabilities. And Allie, you had some excellent points from a family business perspective on those key things, like the governance and decision-making. I'd love to hear more about that because creating a plan in of itself is just there. But there's all the things around it, which you talk about are essential from a business standpoint to ensure that the plan gets executed and is successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a huge opportunity, right? To your point, once you have that clarity and everybody stacks hands, there's so much power in that, right? Then you're getting the wisdom and all the resources really working for the business to accelerate results. So what it comes down to is authentic decision-making and making sure that we all agree on how decisions are going to get made. Separating management and governance is really important. Understanding the role shareholders play, the board, the elected board in a family business. A lot of times they don't have that structure yet. When you're going to grow and really go through change, even if it's just 3 family members in the business, you really need to separate governance and operational management so that you know what decision you're making when and who needs to know and how it gets communicated. And then aligning the PACE or how the power is derived through positional authority or authority through subject matter expertise, control, how you can exercise control over self and others, and influence, how the family uses all those things and who is using them. So to your point, the family member who's not in operational management or in governance, but has relationship with employees or other family members can sometimes be the most powerful force. In one family, it was grandma whose husband was the founder. She never worked a day in the business, but she pulled all the strings, right? Making sure that everybody's at the table and everybody's committed. And if they're not, because you can't always get everybody on board, figuring out how we're going to lovingly deal with that together.
Which all of those things are essential, right? Because creating the plan okay, we're going to do these things, but then people aren't held accountable because, this cousin, they never do what they say they're going to do. And we just deal with that, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
all of that's what creates culture. And so generally those kinds of cultures are not delivering the business results and the level of performance that we want, but it's family. So we just go along with it. And that's why I love you called that out, is the importance of governance and roles. And I like to think, one of the fun things I like to do is think about it like I'm wearing a lot of different hats. So are you showing up as the family member? And then even in that family system, right, you might be a daughter, a cousin, like all these different roles. So you play all these different roles in the context of the family. Then in the context of the business, you might have a functional role, you might have a board role, an executive. So really understanding. And so what you said about governance, if family business owners haven't taken the time to do that work and get clear on the division of labor and not labor, but decision-making, power, control, and authority roles, that's so important. So I love that you called that out.
Yeah. So we are almost out of time. Rather than opening another can of worms, I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
And I think Ed's going to come back in as well and do a wrap up for us in a little bit. So we do have a question in there, and they're asking about a program that can help them gain respect in their business from their partner, who also happens to be their spouse. So Donna, I'll let you start. Just general leadership dynamics with a partner. I'll add in the family dynamics piece. How's that?
I'm thinking, Allie, it starts with family dynamics, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so hard. I also work with my partner and spouse, and I always like to joke, you can't performance manage your spouse. So it's how do you understand each other, right? And I don't know that there's any particular program that enables that to happen. A couple of things, and I think it really starts personally, is the how are you learning and growing? Because people always respond in terms of how you learn and grow. So how do you gain respect? We'll just say in general with a family member in a business. Say, for example, I had a job out in the world and I was a sales clerk, and then I got pulled into the family business, right? And then everybody's dismissing me because you were just a sales clerk and now you're in charge of whatever. So to me, it's around building trust and credibility comes from your capability, right? And your character and your capacity. So all of those together enable people to believe in you, but then you bring in the systems, family systems, and that can have an impact too. So I'd love to hear what you have to share, because all those patterns can be a challenge.
You're right about that, Dawn. I love what you shared. I think you're so spot on. That the additional piece that we have is Mark Twain once said that familiarity breeds contempt. A contemporary in the UK, his name just jumped out of my mind, said, well, may not breed contempt, but it takes the edge off of admiration. So there's no program, quick fix, silver bullet, but we're talking about culture change. So in that lens, what you can measure and name and call out objectively can help manage the emotion. The other piece of it is you have to think about personality dynamics and the health of the marital relationship. If you're struggling to get respect from your partner at work, you can be smart, capable, all these things, but what's happening in the marriage? What's happening in the relationship? How is that spilling out at work? And it starts there, really understanding that. Matter of fact, the first family business I ever worked with, I didn't even know I was going to do this, but as a marriage and family therapist, people would come in and you'd sit there, you go through the assessment, but you get a feel. And you knew three appointments and they're just checking the box on the way to divorce court. They're never going to do the work. I had a couple and I put them in that box, but I always check my bias, be present, and give them the benefit of the doubt. They stayed for the whole year. At the end of that year, the husband, it was a final session, the husband said, can you do what you did for me and my wife with me and my management team? Wow. Because he said the same things he was doing to his wife, he was doing to his management team. And you know what? The rate of change on the management team was so much faster than in the marriage because we can only deal with what they bring in the room. Change can happen much more effectively when there's this external force, culture, helping to shape and address some of the behaviors. Hey, Ed.
Hey, Allie, that does raise a question as you were talking. I've heard this question before in other settings, and it's come up again today. There's obviously external factors like pandemics and recessions and things of that nature that can impact an organizational culture. There's things that can happen in an industry. The newspaper industry obviously has taken a hit over the last several years because of digital media. There's organizational things that can happen, but you started to touch on it a little bit. And it led me to the question in my mind that I've heard before too is, I know there's not a litmus test. There's not like a check the box and this is happening, but to either of you, are there things internally in a family that you've seen, without naming names, obviously, that others might watch for? If this is happening in my family, we might be heading down a dangerous path. I know there's probably a lot, but if there's one or two things that either of you would like to address on that maybe our viewers and listeners could be maybe looking out for, or thinking, wow, if this is happening in my family, we might be on a dangerous path.
Can I start?
Sure.
Yeah, go.
Something just came to mind, and it connects back to a point I made around leadership, where the leader who says you need to change, you're the problem. So to your question, Ed, right? If there's somebody coming in being like, okay, that my family's a mess, they need to do this, they need to do that. And Allie can tell me I'm on point or not, but I would say it starts with you. Right? Are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to make the change? Are you willing to see things from new perspectives, get the roles in place, get the governance in place, do what needs to get done, versus I don't personally believe that anything is impossible as long as people are willing to do the work and make the change.
Donna, you hit the nail on the head. As long as people are willing to do the work and make the change. The other piece of it is, do they have enough awareness? Yes. So, Ed, I think one of the signals that family businesses could look for is when, so that you can look up Google Johari window. There's parts of ourselves that we're aware of. There's parts that we're not aware of that other people are aware of. There's parts that nobody's aware of. And there's parts that we keep hidden, right? So in the family business, if we see a lot of people inadvertently hurting each other, right? They have low other awareness. They're impacting people and they don't realize how they're impacting people. We have fuses that are getting shorter and shorter, right? The tensions ratcheting up. They can start to see some of those early signs. Meetings get shorter, but tighter. Nobody's talking in the meeting. They're having all the side conversations and workarounds and triangulating outside. Triangulation is probably the number one destructor of a leadership team or of culture change.
Yes.
So if they start to see some of those behavior patterns, working around a family member, working around a non-family executive, not respecting people's roles, those are warning signs.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We could go on and on. We are up against our time, but thank you both so much, Allie and Donna, for taking the time, not just today with us and in previous months, but your preparation and just the research that you do and the work that you do for family business. At the Center for Family-Owned Businesses at First Bank, obviously, we're all about family business. So it's just refreshing to work with two individuals like yourselves who we've worked with for a long time, who get it and who are just great resources for not only the families we serve, but other families as well. If someone wants to reach out and have a deeper conversation with either of you, Donna, I'll start with you first. What's the best way for them to contact you? And then Allie will go to you, and then I'll wrap up and talk about next month's webinar.
Excellent. So anybody, I'd love to hear questions. And for those of you who would be interested, I have something called the 5 culture activators. It's something you can do to activate the culture that you have, which Allie said, hey, family culture is the reason you have a competitive advantage. So let's activate it. I'd love to share that with you. And you can get that. Email me at Donna, DNA, at Brighton Leadership.
And Allie?
First, I love Donna's culture activators, and I love working with her. She's a master, so I would reach out and get it for sure. We have a white paper available for you that brings together this conversation. Now that we've had this conversation, I'd like to amend a couple of things. And
there you go.
But the white paper will be available on our website or by emailing me, Allie, ALIE, at OCKiwi.com.
And get that white paper. It's awesome. I had a pre-read and you don't want to miss out.
And all of these resources and contact information, everything is and will reside on our website, first.bank/family business. All of the webinars that we do, podcasts, research, articles, feature stories on family business. There's plenty of resources there. Next month, we ask that you'll join us February 21st from 2 to 3 p.m. Central or 12 to 1 here Pacific time. Good dear friend of mine, Meredith Elliott Powell. She's a member of the National Speakers Hall of Fame. She's just a fantastic presenter. Her topic is turning economic uncertainty into opportunity and how to gain a competitive advantage. So how do we take all these things we've been through, even this culture conversation we're having today, and turn that to our advantage? So thank you all for joining us today. We know you have a lot of choices of what to do with each hour of your day, and we greatly appreciate you choosing to spend this hour with us. And again, Dr. Allie Taylor, Donna Brighton, can't thank you enough from my heart and from the Center for Family-Owned Business at First Bank. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you all just a wonderful week. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.